Hello and welcome to this ESS revision video on species and populations, the topic 2.1. And today we're going to be looking at the effects of carrying capacities on species and what can cause population changes. And let's start off then by looking at this theoretical idea. Well, it's not theoretical, this actual idea, and we'll explain it during the video. So one area which I have a lot of knowledge on is great white sharks, and in South Africa the great white shark population seems to be dropping. So one thing I've asked my students to think about is what is the reason for this, and list as many possible reasons as you can, and we'll come back to that during the video. So there are some key terminologies that you need to understand that you'll be using throughout this module, and you need to try and ensure you're referring to them correctly as you're doing this module. So the first term that I think is really important to understand is the term species, and a species is a group of organisms with similar physiological physiology which can breed to produce fertile offspring. Another definition that you need to know is the term population, and the population is a group of organisms that live in the same place at the same time. A similar term then is the term community. So community is where one species lives in the populations where one species, but a community is where all of the species interact with each other. And then habitat, hopefully you understand, is where an organism lives, whereas the ecosystem is the self-contained system including all the organisms interacting with each other, but also the place and the systems within there, leaving niche, which is a species' share of habitat and its resources in it. So it's what we offer to the role of that species within the habitat. So there's the definitions for you again, and you can look at them and make sure you're happy with them. So as we said before, a species is a group of organisms that resemble each other closely, so they might have a similar physiology, a similar appearance, similar biochemistry, but they must be able to be classed as the same species to produce a fertile offspring. And you must always be specific whenever talking about species and whenever referred to them using the species name. So not, for example, not just saying a shark, saying a great white shark, so you're being specific to that particular. Now, species have been understood due to taxonomy, and we've grouped species due to their evolutionary origins and their relationships. And this is really important because if you were to just look at it and say wings, these three species would be the same species, because birds, insects and bats all have wings, but wing structure differs greatly, and evolutionary wise they have adapted to be quite different. And we use this to then organise the science of classification. So here the most closely related, i.e. ones in the same species, are a species, and then as you get further and further away from that, you get less and less similar related. But obviously we've grouped all the kingdom animals together in the kingdom, then all chordates, which are animals with backbones, together, then all mammals, so on, that give birth to live young, then all primates, and so on and so on. And you need to know the idea of naming species. So to name species, we always use the genus name, which for humans is Homo with a capital letter, and it's written in italics. And for the final part of the name is always the species name, and the species here is sapiens. And notice there is no capital letter for the start of sapiens, and that's called the binomial. So human name, Homo sapiens. And if you looked at other animals, gorillas, I think it is, it's Homo habilis. That's the binomial system. So the species genus name should always be in a capital letter, okay, which is that bit there. And then the species name should always be in lowercase there. And if you're doing it on a computer, it should be italics. If you wrote it by hand, so if I wrote in this one by hand, and I wrote, there you go, so Homo sapiens, I can't write that in italics, so I underline it to show that it's a species name, so it stands out. So going back to our great white sharks, hopefully you can think of some ideas of why their population may be changing in numbers, but don't forget they are the apex predator, so that is going to make potentially it a bit harder. But effectively, why does a population change? Well, population rate might go up if the natality or the birth rate increases. If the mortality rate goes up, the population might drop. And there could also be migration, which could be either emigration out of a habitat area or out of a certain area in the world, or immigration into an area. So the term which we mentioned earlier, which you need to know about, is niche, and this is the species share of a habitat and the resources in it. So a niche is effectively where that species is, and therefore it might have a particular effect or a particular role on that species. Now there are two terms that you need to be aware of. There is a fundamental niche, which is the total range that species could theoretically tolerate in, but then there is the realised niche, which is the actual resources and conditions that species exists in, and that might be due to other biotic factors. So for example, in this first picture here, you might have a larger area that animal could in theory habit and live in, but actually due to being out-competed, for example, it might only live in the smaller middle area of the pond in this case. So what might affect where an organism lives could be the abiotic factors. So abiotic factors are non-living factors. So for example, in the water here, it could be stuff like pH, temperature, light intensity, salinity. Okay, in a pond, obviously salinity won't be an issue, but it might be temperature again, it might be pH again, and in the terrestrial area, it might be temperature, altitude, light intensity, and anything like that that can affect where an organism lives, called biotic factors. Biotic factors here, there are 6 biotic factors, and each can affect the carrying capacity of a species, which means how much of an organism can live in an area, what the population can be. So if we go through, your first one here looks like it is an example of competition, particularly intraspecific competition. Disease, which is obviously caused by microbes and pathogens. Okay, we've got symbiosis or symbiotic relationships. So the bird doesn't get eaten by the crocodile because they support each other. It could also be called mutualism. Okay, you can have pests and insects and pests causing that one. You can have being hunted. You can have the amount of herbivores on a land as well. So there are 2 general groups of competition that you need to be aware of. It could be, as shown in this picture, you've got 2 hippos fighting, 2 snakes fighting, and 2 dogs fighting here. These are all examples of intra-specific competition. So when it's intra, it means that the animals are within the same species, and they will have great effects on the population size because they're competing against the same species, so it can only help but lower the population size. But it does benefit natural selection because the most adapted of the individuals will survive to pass on their genes. Interspecific competition is between 2 different species, so inter with an ER as opposed to intra, and this occurs when 2 different species have an overlapping niche. And the niche is overlapping, which means that they're going to then compete for the same resources. Both populations will end up getting less resources, so the carrying capacity of that population, the total population that can be carried, will drop, but one of them will normally outcompete the other one because there's less energy and growth for both of them to reproduce with, but normally one will do better. The less adapted species is more likely to be outcompeted in the long term because its resources will be reduced too much, and this is called competition exclusion. So in the UK, the red squirrel has been largely outcompeted by the grey squirrel due to competition exclusion. And that things they might compete for is food, habitat, and that would give them, the squirrels particularly, more fat and more survival. So going back to our sharks, it's not 100% certain, but we do believe, and there's more and more evidence now, that it is this reason here, that orcas are actually hunting the great white shark as food and outcompeting the great white shark, and the sharks haven't necessarily dropped in numbers, but they have emigrated, whereas there's been a decline in South Africa. Californian populations are now increasing. So this has suggested that a competition being hunted by the predator has, by the smarter group pack mentality whales, has outcompeted the sharks, and they've moved somewhere else as a result, leading us not to believe that the fishermen competing with the shark's food is a massive impact. So this takes us then to population curves. We need to understand what affects the carrying capacity of a species, know what factors affect it. We'll talk about that. So the carrying capacity, which is represented by this dotted line here, is effectively the maximum population size which the ecosystem can maintain over time. And it's affected by limiting factors, which are anything that will limit the size of a population. So we said there's biotic and abiotic factors earlier in this video. And you need to be able to explain what's happening in terms of the natality, in terms of the mortality, available resources and competition at each of these stages. So at stage A, which we often call the acclimatization stage or the lag phase, the species are getting used to their new conditions if they've been put in a new environment. They've got a lot of available resources and low population numbers. So at this point, the natality is maybe slightly ahead, but there's not much mortality. The population is getting used to its surroundings, very little competition, and they start to then reproduce. At point B, we've got the exponential phase or the log phase or the growth phase. At this point, the resources are high. There's a lot of high natality because there's a lot of reproduction happening, low mortality rate, and resources are high enough to prevent competition from causing a problem. But at point C, all of a sudden the resources are becoming limited, and that means then that the natality rate might be dropping, the mortality rate might start to increase, and there's more competition between the species, more intraspecific competition, definitely. So these population curves take two sort of shapes. There's this S curve, which also can be called the sigmoid population curve, and that is the idea that the population always takes this shape because of what we call environmental resistance. So at first the population increases rapidly because there's very little environmental resistance, because at this point we've got high amounts of resources, but then we have low amounts of resources, so the population levels off to hit the carrying capacity. The other type of population curve is called a J curve, and this is when the carrying capacity is reached rapidly, because these populations have what we call an overshoot method, so they will reproduce rapidly and their numbers will increase before the resources can limit them, so they overshoot and then they die back, and then they may overshoot again, then die back and overshoot again. So the population increases, then it suddenly collapses, dying back. Now, examples of these types of animals, you can look at them, don't need to know specific examples, but you can use the characteristics. So a K strategy is one that doesn't massively go over the carrying capacity, will generally have a longer lifespan. So these are the ones that follow that sort of diagram there. They'll have fewer of them being born each time, so lower numbers of offspring. They'll have later onsets of maturity. They tend to have larger body size, and more than once they'll reproduce during their lifetime. Parental care is often common because the parents invest in looking after the offspring because there are less children, and the environment tends to be a stable one. So examples of K strategies would be humans, elephants, because those things take longer to reproduce. But examples of an R strategy is one that goes over the carrying capacity and goes up and down, is ones that have short lifespans. They'll have lots of offspring early on in life with a smaller body size. Parents tend to not care for their offspring, and they may reproduce once in a lifetime, although this one isn't always the case in terms of rats, for example, and their environment seems to be unstable. So examples of this would be rats, fish of many types, and bacteria. So you need to be able to identify this if you're given any examples, and think of those key characteristics to decide are they S or J curve strategists.